everyone. I'm Mohammed Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the Institute's Iranian Studies book launch featuring Professor Domenico Ingenito or Ingenito, recently published his recently published book on Forugh Farrokhzad. Thank you, Professor Ingenito, for accepting our invitation to visit Toronto and experience with us our inspiring cold weather and warm gathering. I'm also grateful to our partners for today's event, the Department of Italian Studies at the University of Toronto and the Italian Cultural Institute of the Consulate General of Italy in Toronto. At the outset, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to the Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River for thousands of years. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. I welcome Professor Ingenito of the UCLA to the University of Toronto, and my colleague, Dr. Abulfazl Moshiri, the Woman Poets Iranica Research Associate, will introduce our speaker.
Pleasure. Thank you. It is my immense pleasure to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Professor Domenico Ingenito, to the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. Dr. Ingenito is Associate Professor of Iranian Studies and Pre-Modern Persian Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles, Bahari Fellow in the Persian Art of the Book, Bodleian Library, Oxford University, core faculty member of the Forugh Center for the Study of Iranian War, and former director of the UCLA program on Central Asia 2016-2021. His research interests center on ancient and medieval Iran, Persian poetry, visual culture of Iran and Central Asia, gender and translation studies, and pre-modern manuscript culture. His publications are simply too many to enumerate here. Only to name a few is his article titled Hafez's Shirazi's Turk, a geoethical approach, published in Journal of Iranian Studies. His chapter titled Jahan Malik Khatun, Gender, Canon, and Persona in the Poems of a Pre-Modern Persian Princess, the volume titled The Beloved in the Middle Eastern Literature, and finally, his magnum opus so far, Beholding Beauty, Saadi of Shiraz, and the Aesthetics of Desire in Medieval Persian Poetry, which perhaps is one of the most important significant books on Saadi of Shiraz ever written in English language, published by Brill in 2018. For today's talk, in our Iranian Studies book launch series, Professor Ingenito, in a welcome departure from classical Persian literature, will be unveiling his most recent book titled parlo confini, della notte, نهایت شب حرف میزنم, I speak from the edge of the night, which is the critical edition with Italian translation of the entire works of the most celebrated Persian female poet, Forugh Farrokhzad, which was published recently in October 2023, if I'm not mistaken, by the famous Bompiani publishing house in Milan, Italy. I heard the book was so popular that the first print went out of print, sold out in a matter of less than 2 months. And as we speak, the book is in the second print. Without further ado, Professor Ingenito.
من از نهایت شب حرف میزنم. من از نهایت تاریکی و از نهایت شب حرف میزنم. اگر به خانه من آمدی برای من ای مهربان چراغ بیار و یک دریچه که از آن به ازدحام کوچه خوشبخت بنگرم. Io parlo dai confini della notte, dal termine del buio, e parlo dei confini della notte. Se vieni a casa mia, caro, portami un lume e uno spiraglio da cui puoi guardare la folla nel vicolo felice. Thank you so much for your warm welcome. I'm very excited, very honored to be here with all of you. I've been following the activities of the center for many years now via Zoom, and it's an immense pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Tavallodi, for your invitation. Thank you, dear friend and colleague, Farrokhzad. Yes, this was a labor of love that ended up becoming a serious thing. So I was not expecting to becoming a sort of an aspiring scholar of Farrokhzad studies, but this is, I'm trying to do now. And I started translating Farrokhzad. It was my first encounter with Persian literature, actually, when I was in my early 20s. And I started teaching myself Persian, reading Farrokhzad's poetry. And I published a small collection in Italy with a tiny publisher in Naples, where I'm from, in southern Italy. And it was a successful publication, even though it was a minor publisher, a tiny selection of a poem. And it was, it became a thing, an editorial thing in Italy. And publishers over the years kept asking me, can we do, the whole collection of collected works of Farrokhzad? And I had a problem. My problem was that even when I was a student, and later on when I started teaching at Oxford, I had a course on modernist Persian poetry, and I would introduce Farrokhzad to my students. And the question was, what editions should we rely on? What is a reliable edition of Farrokhzad's poems? And I discovered that the very first editions that Farrokhzad published during her lifetime were not really available. Not all libraries own copies of these precious publications. And what we refer to as the most common editions today are editions that usually do not really take into account the original publications. So which publications that appeared in journals, in magazines in Iran in the 50s and 60s, and the actual books that Farrokhzad herself authorized, right, for publication. So I decided to, when Bompiani, who is probably the most important publisher in Italy, when they approached me and they said, we have this poetry in translation book series, and we publish only with the original texts. And I said, well, let's start thinking in terms of critical edition. Right? Well, what does critical edition mean? It's up for debate. Right? In the case of modern literature, I'm a medievalist, so a philological approach to the study of literature is something completely different from what is usually done in the context of authors who are still alive maybe today, or authors who belong to the 20th century. So I tried to find all the original editions. I put them together. I compared whenever I could what was printed during when Farrokhzad was still alive. I compared the different editions with what appeared in journals, and so we agreed on a text. So this is not the final stage of what I would like to be, sort of the ideal critical edition one day, maybe with the help of Professor Tavallodi's archives, because I did not take into account all the publications in all the poems that appeared in magazines. So I only relied on what I call the editio princeps, so the reproduction, reflection of what Farrokhzad published in 1955, 56 with Asir, and then I will show you all the chronology of her work. So this is what the book includes. So there is a collection. It's a bilingual critical edition, so it's all translated into Italian verse. There is a critical introduction in which I try to show the importance of Farrokhzad's life and works. And then the 5 collections of poetry, the 4 collections that were published when she was still alive: Asir, Divār, Osiyān, or Osiyān, Tavallodi, digar. And then a collection that was put together after her death, Imam Biavarim Be'ogaz Fasl Sad, let's believe in the beginning of the cold season. And then I tried to extract verses from her beautiful film, Khane Siyah Hast, she composed the original lines for that film, for that cinematographic endeavor. So I decided to extract them, translate them, present them. And then there are these poems that she composed with Yadollah Royai. Very, very interesting. We can talk about those during the Q&A. Poems attributed to Farrokhzad, which is not really clear when they were published, when they were composed, but they appeared in journals and magazines later on, decades after her death. So it's still unclear whether. And then I have two appendices. One is the famous afterword that, with an O, that she published only in the first edition of Asir, in which she defends her own right to write poetry as a woman. It's an important document that disappeared in the later editions, and it's not really easy to find today. So I decided to translate it into Italian. The publisher said, no, this is too much. We're publishing only the Italian translation of the Persian text. And then I have a critical essay in which I analyze Farrokhzad's collections one by one. So we're trying to contextualize them, also in the context of medieval Persian literature and the impact that Persian classics, such as Hafez Divan and the quatrains by Omar Khayyam, pseudo Omar Khayyam, the impact they had on Farrokhzad's own literary creative endeavors. As I said, I'm an aspiring Farrokhzad specialist. I'm not a specialist of Farrokhzad's poetry. I'm only a translator who is in a humbly way, trying to navigate his way through this massive corpus of beautiful lines and ideas about life and art. I owe so much to the work of serious Farrokhzad scholars. First one comes to my mind. The present here is Professor Michael Hillman, a lonely woman who was, I read his book when I was a student in Italy, and he was probably one of the first books that I read, one of the first secondary sources that I read in English when I was a student of Iranian studies in Naples, the Oriental Institute of Naples. And it changed my perspective on my approach to Persian literature. There is an important collection of essays edited by my dear colleagues Domenico Ingenito and Nasrin Rahimieh, Forugh Farrokhzad, Poet of Modern Iran. Beautiful, beautiful collection that second edition was published last year with new chapters. And then there is this groundbreaking work by Professor Farzaneh Milani, which is the most important literary biography of Farrokhzad, which we find also previously unpublished letters. We find interviews that she had with important persons who gravitated around Farrokhzad's life, and which revealed also important details that can help us today rediscover, reread Farrokhzad's literary output also from new perspective. So I owe to these people and many other scholars, right, all the little contribution that I offer with this book, and also in the process of translating, I had to rely constantly on what we know about the life of Farrokhzad and also the complexity of her life, the complexity of her work, and which added more onto the complexity of the act of translation. So trying to find a balance between different universes, between different languages, between different traditions. I regard Gonah, so I'm just showing you a few details about my own approach to Farrokhzad. I've been thinking a lot for my own research interests about the problem of gender and desire in medieval Persian poetry, and how culture-specific every conversation around gender and desire can be, and how important it is to contextualize the relevance and impact of any conversation surrounding sexual sensual desire, regardless of the time period in which it happens. I'm very interested in considering Gonah, the sin, Gonah kardam, Gonah purze lezzat. It's a famous poem. It was, his third scandal when he was published in a magazine in 1954. And I look at this poem as the manifesto, as one of the manifestos of Iranian poetic modernism, because this is the first time that a woman in the history of Persian literature, talks about sex and desire from the perspective of a woman, from the perspective of a female lover. Farrokhzad is not the first woman poet of Iran. I'm working on a project in which I compare Jahan Malek Khatun and Jahan Malek Khatun's own introduction to her collection of poems. She was a contemporary of Hafez Shiraz. She was also Shirazi. She was a princess. Dominic Bruckshall has worked extensively about her. And there are interesting parallels between these two figures. So Guna, I have here an English translation. I'm trying also to translate, even though English is not my native language, but I'm trying to reread Farrokhzad through the lens of my Italian translations and going back to the Persian texts and then reinventing them in English. I sinned, a sin replete with pleasure in a hot embrace that set me on fire. I sinned while held by vengeful arms, resentful arms of steel ablaze. In the darkest, quietest place, I stared into the mystery of his eyes. My heart was quivering inside my chest, elated by his eyes' lustful demands. In the darkest, quietest place, I sat by him, unsettled. His lips then poured desire into my lips. My heart was free from the craze of angst. I whispered words of love into his ears. I want you, oh sweetheart, I want your soulful embrace. You, maddened by love, are all I want. Desire kindled flames across his gaze, scarlet wine dancing inside the cup. Amidst the softness of our bed, my limbs were drunkenly shaking atop his chest. I sinned, a sin replete with pleasure, next to a body entranced by passion. My God, how will I know what I did in that darkest, quietest place? I read it in Italian. Il peccato. Ho peccato. Un peccato colmo di piacere. Ho peccato in un abbraccio caldo e infuocato. Ho peccato fra due braccia forti e ribollenti di rancore. In quel luogo di buio silenzio appartato, guardai nei suoi occhi colmi di segreti. Il mio cuore fremeva furioso nel petto, desiderio nei suoi sguardi vogliosi. In quel luogo di buio silenzio appartato, mi adagiai sconvolta al suo fianco. La sua bocca versava desiderio tra le mie labbra, liberandomi dal tormento del mio cuore folle. Gli sussurrai piano piano il racconto d'amore. Ti voglio, anima mia, ti voglio, abbraccio che infiamma, ti voglio, amore mio folle. Il desiderio spargeva fiamme nei suoi sguardi, il vino nero tremava e danzava nel calice, nel letto soffice le mie forme fremevano, ubriache sul suo torace. Ho peccato, peccato, quanto piacere accanto allo spasimo estatico di un corpo. Oddio, che cosa ho mai fatto in quel luogo di buio, silenzio, appartato? It's getting warm here, even in Toronto. It was reading, finding the original editions of Farrokhzad's poems, comparing also, the poems, the way they were published in magazines and journals, and comparing those with the versions that appeared in the printed books was also a revelation to see also how much Farrokhzad was constantly re-editing her own work, how uncertain, how precise she was about the quest for le mot juste, right? The right word, the right syntactical structure, how she was changing also part of the imagery that she was using. And I was delighted when I discovered these beautiful illustrations that are found only in the very first edition by Mohammad Bahrami, who is still active in Iran, I discovered. And it's interesting also that Farrokhzad included poems in the very first edition that are not found in the following editions of the same book, Asir, a prisoner. I'm going to move this far here. So I decided to include them. So I decided to rely on the edition of Asir that was published in 1963, which was the last authorized edition of this book. And I included also the poems that she decided to eliminate. So it's 2 or 3 poems that are very, very interesting, which also show one of them is titled Bekharam, the strong proto-feminist, if slightly naive, but still very, very important, very powerful, of her juvenile approach to poetry. And I also asked the publisher to publish the illustrations. The publisher said, no, this is not a Farrokhzad encyclopedia, so we're not doing this. Hopefully, the next edition. So I was just showing some of the interesting explicit images. There is this undercurrent of references to autoeroticism that appear as veiled references in Farrokhzad's poems. In a couple of poems like Obtani, you will see it's more explicit, but the illustrations show it in a very clear way. So it's interesting also, it would be interesting to discover what kind of conversations were happening between Farrokhzad, the publisher, and the artists who were working on this. And she makes some, there are references to this editorial process in her letters and some of the unpublished letters that we find in Milanese book. So we'll see in the future research, scholars might dig deeper into this editorial process. I mentioned that this is interesting afterward. The edition, I translated a few passages to give an idea of Farrokhzad's strong determination those first years. She says, for those who dismiss my poetry by saying that it conveys exclusively certain, explicit erotic images, it would be better for them to study this collection of poems while holding back their judgmental stances. In terms of imagery and content, poetry can be expressed through different stylistic aspects. Each one of those can be artistically valuable by measure of the author's efforts in that specific literary aspect or mood. Should I succeed in perfecting this erotic aspect that some readers attribute to me, I'll be exceedingly satisfied still. I decided with all of my inner strength that I want to remain a woman in my poetry. I did not want to wear a mask of purity and chastity in order to hide inner features of a different kind. As Khayyam said, they say I worship wine. Yes, I do. They call me a corrupted drunkard. Yes, I am. Do not dwell on my outer appearance, for I truly am anything I hide inside. Those who want to slander me with these tactics should understand that poetry is a space that frees the artist from all external bonds. I did not devote myself to art and poetry out of amusement or folly. Poetry is my life. And what truly matters to me is the emotion of feeling alive. I do not want to surrender to the comfort of the soul and heart. My highest aspiration is to see my poetry become a manifestation of the beauty and pleasure that life can offer to human beings. I want my poetry to explode with emotion and ardor. I want to pour into the form of my poems all the excitement and the enthusiasm that I feel in my life. And no one, absolutely no one, can blame me for this. A woman has the right to be a woman in her poetry too. And those who cannot accept this will have to wait for the day when, with the advancement of civilization and cultural progress, this right will be established for all Iranian women. These are strong statements, and they got lost in the, they are not really easily accessible today. It's important to go back to these strong manifestations of poetics and the connections between art and poetry and life that she was between poetry and life that she was so keen to expand upon. That's why I will say something more about this. I try to read Farrokhzad's confessional moments, his most lyric, juvenile, erotic statements and compositions in verse, not as the reflection, the simplistic reflection of life experience, but as a performative act, as a lyric performance, as a way in which art becomes a source of experience itself. And it has an impact on the kind of experience that the artist was having, especially in the domain of erotic experiences. I'll say something more about this. It's something that I emphasize a lot in my introduction. This is of Tani, which we discussed, and we had a conversation with your friend Muhammad about the different variants that are found in the first edition of the poem, and which appeared in a magazine, and then in Divār, The Wall, published in 1956. We all know about all the turmoil that Farrokhzad experienced. Both Professor Hillman and Professor Milani show us in great detail. I trace very precisely all the different events that took place during her 20s. And then after the publication of Divār, The Wall, she decided to travel to Italy and Germany between end of 56, 57, probably until 58. It's not clear about exactly when she returned to Iran. She published a beautiful travelogue called digar, which is an interesting way to announce formally the title of her last collection of poetry, Tavallodi digar. She's influenced by European modernist and existentialist poetry. She translates from Italian and from German into Persian. And all these experiences culminate into the publication of this still understudied, but beautiful, precious collection, extremely ambiguous also, of poems called Osiyān or Asiyān, depending. The first edition says, specifies that it's Osiyān, but colleagues, also people who know Farrokhzad, know that she would say interchangeably Osiyān or Asiyān, so I prefer Osiyān. And then eventually we have Tavallodi digar, which is again the manifesto of Persian literary modernism in poetry, even though she did not think of Tavallodi digar as a cohesive piece of work. It's not. It's a collection. It's not a book, according to Farrokhzad. It's interesting what she says, how critical she is of her fellow poets and also of herself. Some translators in the past decided not to translate Farrokhzad's first collections of poetry because they say, well, she disavowed them. She did not really like anymore her first efforts, but she kept publishing them. She kept re-editing those. So I think it's an important body of work that needs to be rediscovered, needs to be studied, needs to be translated into English as well, hopefully one day. Is there anyone in the audience who recognizes these pictures? What's happening here? What's going on? Where was? Yes? Play, yes, by Nobel Prize Luigi Pirandello, 6 characters in search of an author. Shakhsiyat dar jostujuy yek nevisande, directed by Paris Alberi, who's still active in Tehran, and during 1964, a few months before Tavallodi digar was published. I do not want to say that this theatrical endeavor, influenced the major themes that we find in Tavallodi digar, but I think that it did have an impact. If not in Tavallodi digar, in the poems that then appeared in Imam Biavarin be Agaz Fasl Zard. The fragmentation of the self, the lack of meaning, the painful intertwinement between poetry and life, between literature, fiction, and life. These all characters are very dear to Pirandello, and I wonder to what extent, Farrokhzad, who was impersonating, some reviews say, with strong motivation, this character, what kind of role they played in the way that she developed her own poetry. So we see how she's developing already by the early 60s, late 50s, this idea of art as a total, all-encompassing project. All aspects of our life are devoted to art and to the arts. And she explores, she writes short stories. She also plays as an actress in theater. She meets, of course, Ebrahim Golestan, who passed away only a few months last summer, who some critics regard as the great enabler or the great catalyst of Farrokhzad's artistic endeavor. I look at him as a resource, he was Farrokhzad lover, and he offered a space. He offered a space in his life. He offered financial resources, but Farrokhzad's artistic maturity was already there, which is already clear in the way that she approaches her connection with the arts when she travels to Europe. So we don't need to, this patriarchal tendency of reading Farrokhzad's success in life and in the arts as the result of her encounter with Golestan. Was an important producer and writer, but I don't think that I don't think Farrokhzad owes much to him, not the resources that he put at her disposal. But we can have a conversation about this. This is beautiful poem, Scarlet Rose. I tried also to reconstruct the way that it was. Yes, I picked this poem because we discovered that what the biographical event that caused they inspired the composition of this poem, and it's a very painful event that I don't want to dwell too much on it, but Farrokhzad Milani in her conversation with Ibrahim Golestan discusses quite at length what happened and how it happened. But it's beautiful to take into account life events and vicissitudes and reread a poet's production through those new elements that resurface, right? It's interesting to me specifically because I was trained as a formalist. I studied with Umberto Eco in Bologna, semiotics, and to me also the school of Roland Barthes and Algirdas Graemus, and the idea was that we have to approach literary text as literary text, and we should not be influenced by the biographical aspects of an author's life, which goes against the old school of Iranian studies approach to medieval Persian poetry. So I was sort of juggling with these different paradigms. And to me, reading Farrokhzad, translating Farrokhzad in my early 20s meant that I should not care about her biography. I should just pay attention to what she says. And now I'm revisiting my early approach and trying to make sense of the impact of biography. To what extent, and what does it mean? How can we think about biography as performance? How can we think about life as performance, especially in the context of her first poems? I have a few poems. I don't want to take much of your time. Maybe we can read. These are other translations of mine to English. You can read this later. I wanted to share only a few words, if I have 5 minutes. What happens when we translate into a different language? How does the act of translation influence our critical perception of a given author? It's a major question, right, in the field of translation studies. So I tried, when translating Farrokhzad, the first question was, how can I recreate Farrokhzad's poetry in a way that is, on the one hand, respectful of the original text, right, which is what I should do especially when I present the collected works, right? I want this to be a reference book. I want students, I want readers to say this is, there is some sort of correspondence between, especially when we have the text of the original text right in front of the translation. But on the other hand, this is a poetry collection of poetry translation. So I used to be a poet in Italy. So it was also, but I had to distance myself from that because I want to respect also the originality of this author's voice. And I try to think in terms of canons. So what is the modernist canon in Italy? Who are the authors who transformed the literary panorama of Italy during the 20th century? And what kind of disruptive moments do we find in the context of Italian literature, which can be somehow connected directly or indirectly with what Farrokhzad did in Iran between the 50s and the 60s? There are different elements here that are interesting. On the one hand, Farrokhzad traveled to Italy, so she was exposed to the Italian tradition to an extent. She was exposed for sure to the German tradition. She was combining her own appreciation of the Persian classics with the way the Persian classics entered the German European canon through translation during the 18th and 19th centuries. The Goethe-Zeit, for instance, could not be fully understood if we do not take into account the impact of the German translations of Persian poetry, right? For Namur Burgstall, for instance, or many other authors, and up to Rilke. Persian poetry is very present. And so German modernism was somehow already saturated with important aspects of the reception of the Persian classics in Europe. And Farrokhzad was exposed to that. So it's easy to see how all these elements come together. When reading also the moderate approach that Farrokhzad had in revisiting the classical meters, so the classical forms of a tradition. She was not a radical innovator from this point of view. She did not create new meters right away. She was very close to original forms, the original forms of modernist poetry. She was very close to the Nemaic poetry. She broke sort of free, but she never abandoned classical meters, only very last experiences that she had. I think of authors such as Antonia Pozzi, Pierpaolo Pasolini, Cristina Campo, and Amelia Rosselli. Probably they're not very known. There are a few translations of their works, but I was looking at them mainly when translating first, and then when reassessing critically the impact of Farrokhzad's poetry. And these are the main points that I came up with when comparing her, her production with these authors that I mentioned here. Looking at Farrokhzad as a global modernist poet, so considering transnational Eurasian trends, she was retranslating also from Chinese poetry. She talks about that in some interviews. It's also interesting. Reinvention of the lyric canon, how she relates to the lyric canon, how she tries to reinvent it. Imitation and critique of classical forms. Again, she had this interesting way of reading Hafez and Khayyam through the lens of Sadegh Hidayat, I think. So it was a westernized rereading of these authors, which reconnected them with the Germanized version of the same authors. It's also, it's more intricate than it seems. So we should look into this correspondences more carefully. Confessional poetry as performative fiction, so rather than direct reflection of experience. So I try to think visual artists, Diane Arbus, Marina Abramovich, Nan Golding, Cindy Sherman. How do artists think about their own relationship between, our own relationship between our own biographical experiences and art, and how Farrokhzad's extramarital experiences, her erotic exploration of Tehran in connection with the exploration of the literary circles of Tehran, while she had a husband and a child in Ahvaz, and the way she writes about it, and the way she's not, she expresses without any veils these encounters in a way that is semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical. We never really know where the boundaries between reality and fiction are. She writes down the days in which specific poems were composed, where they were composed. I also try to show how there's this back and forth between Ahvaz and Tehran. And she's very clear. She's very adamant about this. And I don't want to read it as a simplistic way of talking about one's experiences, but I think that there is a staging of experience here. A staging of experience that in its own right influences experience. So the art that promotes the quest for new experiences and then reappears in different ways in other contexts. So these are also elements that I try to think about. And then this is also important. I was questioning, so we know that in medieval Persian poetry, lyric poetry, the desiring subject is an adult male, and the desired object, the object of desire, is a young man as well, right? Usually a teenager. Idealized, if you want, not necessarily a real figure, but there's a strong homoerotic component that forced female authors, such as Jahan Malik Khatun, to adopt a male voice, even when they were not hiding their own biological gender as women, and pretending to be men who are in love with a young boy. So this is interesting. There is this idea of I call it a homonormative eroticism in classical Persian poetry. Farrokhzad starts writing poetry in a period in which in Iran, this is Janet Afery wrote extensively about this, in which modernizing literary canon meant to heterosexualize the lyric canon. So the ideal young male beloved of the classical tradition now becomes this ideal woman. In a cultural environment that did not really experience romanticism as it was known in Europe. So everything happened very quickly between the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. So Farrokhzad, when she says, I want to be a woman who writes as a woman, she said, I want to adopt a female voice who stages her desire for a male adult, which is the first time it happens in the history of Persian lyric poetry. So there is this non-conventional heterosexual expression of desire, right? So there is a non-normative heterosexuality in Farrokhzad's poetry, because there is this reversal, there's inversion of the gender cipher of desire. So it's not anymore the man who describes the young man, or the modern Iranian man who describes the young, beautiful, idealized woman, but is the woman who now looks into the eyes of her male adult beloved. Beautiful poem, Ma'shuq Man, right? Which we see, the full extent of this process, my beloved. And she it's interesting, right? It's a heterosexual desire can be seen as a non-normative endeavor in this context. And last, there is this tendency of non-Islamic, crypto-Christian, pantheistic, at times mystical trends in Farrokhzad's poetry, mature output. I always read Farrokhzad as a very materialist author, but the way she talks about her own poetry in her diaries, in her letters, in her pages of literary critique, there is at times this undercurrent of mysticism that does not seem to be connected to the Iranian Irfan. I think there are other sources there, of course, influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition in a way. We see this in Osiyān or Osiyān. But I'm interested in seeing also how can we, and Cristina Campo is one of the authors who I looked at to explore this aspect. I mentioned Antonia Pozzi, who killed herself, unfortunately, in 1938. And her style, to me, was one of the sources of inspiration for the way I approached Farrokhzad. So I spent a whole summer reading all of Antonia Pozzi's poetry to make her style mine, and then recompose it in Italian. She has this poetics of the twilight, of the darkness of the night, of inner turmoil that tries to find expression through the observation of nature, that it resonates a bit with Farrokhzad's. I have a poem translated by Amy Newman, Noon. In this golden sunlight, I am a fuzzy flower bud, purely tied with a piece of twine, so I can't open to bathe in light. Next to me you are, calming freshness of grass, in which I'd like to sink madly and dissolve myself in an intoxicating tangle of green, to cast into subtle roots my sharpest pangs and become a part of the earth. Sounds Farrokhzad in a way. Of course, it's easy to see connections, in poetry and lyric poetry, but there are elements that, especially in Italian, I'm not reading in Italian here. Ameria Rosselli. Ameria Rosselli is the other opposite. Is she was not a romantic poet. She was not a confessional poet. She's the most interesting experimentalist in the history of Italian poetry in the 20th century. She killed herself in 1996. A wonderful, wonderful multilingual poet. She wrote in French, Italian, and English, and she played extensively with the classical meters of the Italian tradition. So I was trying to think also the more mature phase of Farrokhzad, what she was trying to achieve with, for instance, poems like Tanha Sedas Ke Mimonad. I looked at Rosselli's, as I have here an example of her poetry. There is something like pain in the room, and it's partly overcome by the weight of objects wins their way of signifying weight and loss. There is something like red in the tree, but it's the orange of the lampstand, but in places I don't want to remember because they too carry weight. Since I can know nothing of your hunger, the stylized fountains are precise in their desire. A destiny of people separated by oblique noise can, when overturned, fall into place quite well. And eventually, and I'll conclude here, Pierpaolo Pasolini. My question was, how can I translate the impact? By the way, one of the most important theorists of translation, Henri Mechanique, says We should not translate only the meaning of a poem. We should translate what the poem does, not only what the poem says, but also what the poem does. What is the impact of a poem? We need to try to translate that impact, that effect on the audience. What is the impact of a poem like Gonah in the Iranian society of the 1950s, Tehran and Hawaz? Does it compare to the impact that women poets in Italy had when writing about desire? First of all, we don't really have any Italian woman poet who wrote about desire explicitly in Italy, which is an interesting element. We don't have, in the 50s, there was absolutely no voice for women to express explicitly their own sensual desires in poetry. So this is one element. But at the same time, how can I think critically about that impact without necessarily keeping gender as a fixed logic? So I try to show how the impact that Farrokhzad had in Tehran in the 1950s compares to the impact that homosexual poetry had in Italy in the 1960s and 70s, and the kind of reaction and scandal that it produced that, unheard of, right? For the first time, and I think of Paolo Pasolini, whom Farrokhzad met in Italy. And it's still unstudied. I don't think that there are any publications about the relationship between Pasolini and Farrokhzad. Pasolini's major works appeared after Farrokhzad's death. I would be curious to read more about and think more about this problem. And there is this poem that Pasolini dedicated to his lover, Inetto Davoli, which in a way can resonate with what Farrokhzad was trying to do when bringing something completely new to the literary scene of Tehran in those years. This is from the 70s. This poem is from the 70s. So after much weeping in secret and in front of you, after having staged many acts of desperation, you made the final decision to surrender and never to be seen again. I'm done. I've acted like a madman. I will not let the water run from the source of my evil and my good. These pacts between men are not for you. Or perhaps you're too skilled in the art of breaking them, guided by Jenny that gives you certainty by which you are transfigured. You know the right button to push. When I speak, you tell me no, and I tremble with disgust and fury at the thought of our unforgettable happy hours. Thank you for your attention. This is all for it.
Thank you, Professor Ingenito, for your thought-provoking and inspiring presentation. If you would allow me to turn to our colleagues here for some questions. Yes, Sarah, please. A little bit louder.
Good question. It makes me reconsider the relationship between biography and fiction, which is something that we don't, we say we don't know anything about these poets, at least for the medieval period. We know so little. We don't go there. We don't question. We just focus on text as such. And it's a very strong structuralist approach that we have still today. It makes me think that we should come up with new paradigm. We should think more critically about, the porosity of this boundaries, right, between fiction and no, it's a good question. It makes me think also in a more complex way about gender dichotomies. It makes me think in a more complex way about the ungendered nature of desire in the classical tradition. The fact that we assume now that the beloved is male presence, the lover is a male presence as well, but maybe the genderlessness of that rapport is even more important. And I try to follow this line of thought with my work on Sadi in the context of the Golestan and his pseudo autobiographical fictions, in which he goes to Kashgar. Of course, he never went to Kashgar, but he talks about that and he brings in his poetry. But Farrokhzad helps me think more about that.
Please.
Yes, there is something very interesting. Tavallodi digar, the poem Tavallodi digar. I don't have it here, but we all more or less know what I'm talking about. It's a beautiful meditation. We read it as a beautiful meditation on one's life experience, transition between different time, different lifetimes, and when Farrokhzad was asked about the meaning of the poems, she says, this is a mystical poem. She says. And there is a line in which is very ambiguous syntactically. I think that she talks about the perception of the moon and the perception of darkness. Edrake ma by edrake zolmat, I think she says, something like this. And they ask her, what does it mean? How do you translate this? Oh, no. This is not our perception of the moon. It's not our perception of darkness. Ghanum Parvar writes about this too, I think, in one of his chapters. But this is the moon's perception. The moon perceiving things, so the darkness being able to perceive things, which is not a given. When we read the poem in Persian, the more sort of straightforward way to read it syntactically is say, well, this is our perception of the moon and our perception. She says, no, this is because we're nothing when facing the greatness of the moon or the greatness of darkness. And she said, this is, and then when she talks about the narcotic pause between two love-making sessions, between two intercourses, like lighting a cigarette in one of the long lines, lighting a cigarette. Life is lighting a cigarette. Sorry, I'm butchering the English translation, but life is like lighting a cigarette in a narcotic pause between two sexual intercourses. She says this is the moment between different instances of the creation destruction of the world according to the divine design, which it shocked me when I read this page. And this is one of the questions that I usually ask my students when we read this poem. It's like, do you see this? Can we forget that Farrokhzad had their own critical reading of this poem that makes absolutely no sense when we read it in the context of her own production, in the context of what she was doing or the implied poetics of her works? So I'm trying to think how can we make sense of our own critical, mystical, semi-mystical readings when analyzing her basically non-mystical poetry.
The ancient Greek maybe or
Absolutely. Yes, yeah. And we discover also the influence of Rumi. Rumi is not immediately visible in her works, but she talks about Rumi, and she said that Osiyān, it's a beautiful masnavi that she has in Tavallodi. Yes, of course. She says, I want to show the transcendence of sexual desire through a meter, Vishnu has that is a very recognizable meter that he uses and she represents there, and she talks about that, even though we don't really see specific mystical images in the poem. But the rhythm takes us there. This is interesting. The meter takes us there. Thank you.
Yeah, let's go to the question out there. Which one of you are asking the question?
I hope we have not too much of introduction.
No, absolutely not.
First, what a great pleasure to see you here. And I have a few questions. First, do you have this amazing introduction?
Not yet, no. Yes, there's a plan, but I need to find a time. Yes.
Two questions. So I was listening to, of course, from outside, so please apologize me if I had to miss anything, but to what extent do you see the relation between Furugh's poetic rhythm and meters and the expression of her desire to be related? Something I noticed was the length of stanzas and poetic rhymes, even if, I mean, like, meters, even if it's shared, no, but it's still meter. And then what sort of a challenge it was for you to translate it into Italian, which is because a tonic language by nature, I understand should be very exciting. I don't understand a word of Italian, but when you're reading it, I really enjoyed the tone. So this was the first one. The second, I really enjoyed her questions. But the thing on the relation between Farrokh's sexuality and mysticism, right? And then how do you see it in relation to classical Persian poetry? And what a challenge it was to translate it into Italian, which should have a different sort of mysticism, I assume, in the tradition of Italy. So,
thank you. There two or three? Two questions. Yes. So for the question, yes, I'm sure you heard the way Farrokhzad read their own poetry, right? She tries to tune her meters to her breath. There is this very understated way of following the meter with her breath and then overcoming it, and sort of also almost running out of breath in order to complete the final arkan, right? The final feet of the meters. So she has this overlong meters. She elongates the meter. She stretches it. I think it's a quest for more breath, quest for more space to say. I read it this way. I read it as a research. You know, how much can I say? How much can I hold my breath while I turn it into voice, and how far can I go with it? And of course, this makes no sense in Italian because Italian I started experimenting with iambic pentameters in English a few years ago, and I try to play with the structure of iams in Italian, which is not an Italian, it's not part of the Italian tradition, but trying to break down this, the power, the cardiac power of the ta-tam, 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 and sort of tune it to the length of the Italian. Yes. So trying to see how this heartbeat could work in the elongation of the Italian sonetto form, right? In which you have express the fourth or the sixth syllable, and then you can go on. And Amelia Rosselli does it already, so I was relying on her experiments, even though she's extremely cerebral in the way she does it. She doesn't have the breath, the life breath of stuff. So this is what I did. As far as mysticism is concerned, I did not really think about it. I did not let it influence I stayed very close to the text. I did not want to interpret what I was reading. I just left it as an open question in the critical introduction. Yes. I was trying also breaking the lines in different ways. I was trying to, play. I really like the principle of compensation in translation, meaning that what kind of effect is the meter giving me? If I cannot reproduce, if I cannot reflect the meter, how can I reflect it in semantically, for instance? what kind of choices of words can give an idea of what the meter is already communicating to rhythm. So trying to play with these variables.
Thank you much, Shabnam.
Can you please be loud too?
About influence on other female poets in Iran, did she set the trend?
Yes, I see a trend. I've not been following it very closely. I can think of I can think of Fatemeh Shams, for instance. Even though I don't think it's a direct influence, I can see it in a man, Ilyas Alavi, Afghan Iranian poet, wonderful poet. I see that influence, but I unfortunately I'm not very familiar with contemporary female poetry of Iran. This is something that I need to discover. It's an important. Yes, I have. That's why I thought it was very important to look at the lyric moments that expressed verbally also by Farrokhzad's her own voice, her own. She also translates lines from the Old Testament and reinventing it the way that she, in a similar way that we see in Osiyān. So I thought this is poetry. It should be accessible also in Italian.
To sing in person.
Thank you for being here.
It's fascinating to see the depth and the levels and the diversity that a classical scholar brings to the analysis of the poem. Not only that, but also your attention to the world connections, going to Germany, to Italy, meeting, so on. I'm working on Canada and seeing also the importance of those horizontal connections. Another thing that, again, at present I'm into that and out of it. It seems that so many of the writers and poets are interested in art as well as artists. So she has some paintings. Have you explored that side?
I have not, unfortunately. I have not. No. I was not. No, it's an element I have not really looked at. Yes.
Fascinating.
Because he also a friendship with Sohrab Seperi and the connection with painting and East Asian poetry, the way they were both exploring that aspect that is not really discussed much. But I owe so much to your own work on Farrokhzad and modern Persian literature. This is awesome. You are one of the few scholars who wrote about Asir and who's brought Asir to the forefront of, attention. So thank you for doing that.
Our colleagues online are requesting that we shout so that they can hear you. Fast, can you try that?
Of course I can. I'm trying to shout as much as I can. Thank you for wonderful talk. I followed your travels in Italy.
Yes.
Through social media. What was the reception of Italians when you presented this sort of Middle Eastern female translated into Italian? What was the reaction of Italians and how they compared it to their own sort of poetry?
Yes. The Italian poetic scene is something to behold. It's a jungle of feelings, of experiences. It's like Tehran in the 70s, I would say. It's very political, it's very experimental. There are so many poetry festivals. I have to step back. So when I moved to the US, it's okay, I can relax now. I shouldn't be too entangled with what's happening there. But it's very vibrant. It's a very vibrant, and that's why a poet like Farrokhzad was very well received because it speaks to important questions that Italians still have today. What does it mean to create poetry that has a strong impact on the life of a reader? What does it mean to connect poetry to politics in a way that is not superficial? What does it mean to be an activist without being an activist? What is this sort of activism of second degree or third degree that poetry can aspire to? And it's interesting also there is this polarization in Italy between a conservative approach to poetry, sort of trying to respect the classical forms. And it's very similar to what's happening in Iran between the 40s and the 70s. And also extreme experimentalists. So, and these two groups of poets don't really talk to each other. They boycott each other. They just undermine each other. Farrokhzad is bringing them together. This is so interesting because she speaks to those who seek a more intimate, confessional experience through poetry, and she's something that she defies all patterns and she breaks all the rules. So they see it. The experimentalists also see that. So I witnessed conversations between people from these different groups at poetry festivals or readings which I participated in, which Farrokhzad was occupying the center of the stage so she's seen as a novelty. It's interesting. She's seen as maybe as an opportunity for renewal. Even it's the first time that Italians discover non-Western poetry that is not canonical, and it's and then this happens only thanks to the courage and the boldness of a publisher like Bompiani, right? Every bookshop in Italy, people don't really buy things on Amazon still, so they go to the bookshops. They're still very analogic. So every bookshop has at least one copy in every village, in every small town has at least a copy of the book, right? They published 5,000 copies of the book. This is the second print, so it's a thing. So it's exciting also for me on a personal level to rediscover my intellectual connection with Italy I think overall it's a transformative experience also for Iranian studies as a field, just to see how Italy has a strong tradition in Iranian studies, right? It's Naples, Venice, Rome, Bologna, but now the gap between academia and the making of literature is thinner, I think.
A couple of questions online.
Basic elements to are is there any
Good question. Well, yes, a good question. Should ask my friend Sahba Shoyani, who's working on that.
For that matter, any Qajar period poets, which were immediately kind of read, probably by Forugh.
Yes, I think that there was this element. It should be explored as a possibility. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Clearly, John is non-stomach.
I did not catch the question. I'm so sorry.
You can ask her to
show you
ask the question.
It's not easy to open the voice there, so that's the only problem I have.
Can you ask Bahar to ask?
The problem is not easy to open to open our end of the voice.
Okay, very good.
Yes, I wouldn't say that it's non-Islamic. I would say that her mysticism does not seem to be responding directly to the mysticism that we find in the classical canon, especially because the element of Hafez and Khayyam that she picks, but I'm not saying that Hafez and Khayyam are not mystical poets, but Khayyam is not, of course. Yeah. Well, I don't think Khayyam ever composed any quatrain, but this is something that we can discuss with François de Blois. But he picks aspects of their poetry that are very close to the way Sadegh Hidayat was reading. And the spiritual mystical elements emerge through the Old Testament, her reading of the Old Testament and the Bible. So there is the way that she talks to God, she introduces elements of the divine absolute power that are, of course, part of the Islamic rereading of the Old Testament God, but I see reflections. I see a blending of the two elements, actually. But there is the problem of mysticism there. We don't see any Rumi, we don't see any Attar, we don't see any Sadi, for instance. She didn't like Sadi, at all. I'm very sorry for that. But I wish she had read Sadi's Ghazal more closely.
Professor Saptam.
Thank you.
Mission.
After decades and decades of work, maybe, and with the idea that it will never be a final rendition, but it will be the result of a constant quest of correspondence. And this is what I'm trying to do, because I'm trying to adopt English as my second native language. So it takes time, right? But it also shows you, it makes you feel humble when you go back to your own native language, and it makes you discover that you don't really own your native language either. We don't, because we can forget it very easily. We can just be out of touch, right, from it very, very easily. It took me only 10 years to feel that my Italian was rusty. So I had to read the modern classics of Italian poetry to find again, right, my connection with the rhythm, with the imagery, with the phrases, right, with the idiomatic expressions that I don't really use anymore. Or I think there was it was an artificial process for me to translate into Italian in a way. So it was, translating, rereading, reading out loud, comparing passages with passages from other authors, so they're testing the boundaries of a specific word choice. And so the result is much more artificial than it seems, I think. So I think that with this approach, maybe it's possible to do it in a language that is not your native too, but it requires time, patience, and humility.
Thank you. Asir?
Thanks for your presentation. I enjoyed it. Maybe just one comment to Professor Safani's question is like, maybe you should know society as well to make your translation the thing as the Persian original one. I don't know, maybe it's not just the language, but the society your translation enters.
Of course. When we say that we translate the impact on what, on whom, who's been impacted, and what is the society that, what is the aesthetic community that is receiving the text? How do we take that into account? How do we? So now the problem also is that Persian was, yes, a global language at the time of Farrokhzad, right? It was a Eurasian literary tradition already, but the society she was talking to was a very small group of individuals. It was a small community of intellectuals and readers. So, and it was not particularly multi-ethnic. It was multi-ethnic, but it was a very strong component of Iranianness, of Persianness, and she never really, for instance, she never cared much about Arabic modernism. No? There's absolutely no trace in her works of attention to what was happening in Cairo or Baghdad, and that she was not present at all. So when we translate into Italian is not really a global language today. It's a global culture, but it's not a global language. So there is a very specific target. I can see the faces of people going to read this translation. I know what the contexts are. I know what the squares are, where the poetry festivals happen. English is a completely different thing. It makes things even trickier. What kind of English are we using? What kind of communities are we talking to? Is it how shall we? Is there a standard that we can rely on safely? No, I don't think so. So it's what is the English speaking society that will receive these translations? Which also, going back to the question, it's not all languages had the same kind of relationship with one another, I think. So every language has different problems also from this sociolinguistic point of view. It needs to be explored.
Could you elaborate on or explain more the translation scene in Italy? Like what kind of space it was that Forugh's translation, your book, entered now? So, because I'm from Hungary, and I'm experimenting with translating Forugh as well, because basically we don't have any modern poets, Persian poets translated to Hungarian. And I'm wondering, like, how you create a space with your translation, or how you alter that a certain specific national translation space there.
Or the readership.
Yeah,
right?
so I like your conscious attempt to somehow localize these translations to be able to speak to the Italian reader. So what would you suggest for doing so, or what can a translator do with this kind of big shift?
Yes, it's all about the gatekeepers, publishers. If you can come up with a beautiful work of translation, if you just work with a small publisher who doesn't really have distribution, nothing will happen. If you rely on someone like Bompiani that has this massive sort of, they just send copies of the book everywhere. All newspapers started writing about it, radio stations interviewing me, and they create it. So it was shocking for me to discover that we're nothing if we don't rely on the gatekeepers. It's so interesting, right? So it's important to have connections with the publishers. It's important to have connection with other translators, with writers, with poets, right?
How would
produce.
My question is like, how would those readers accept these kind of works if they don't have any kind of background knowledge or exposure to that kind of cultural literature? So, for example, before that, how many works translated to Italian?
The long tradition of translation in minor publishers, mostly classics. So all on Nizami has been translated to Italian. Ferdowsi was translated in the late 19th century. All the Shahnameh was translated to Italian verse. So imagine. So there is that tradition. There is a strong trend in modern narrative prose. So in novels are being translated quite extensively now into Italian by major publishers. So there is that trend, but poetry had not really. So it's a new thing, and it's it's thanks to the circles of translators that I found a connection with Bompiani. So friends who were translating novels into Italian told me, look, there is this publisher, they're interested, they want to meet you. And so that was the link.
Thank
so
you.
the politics of translation are very important.
We are running out of time, but we have a couple of more questions. Maybe you ask both questions, Bonpa and Yasser, and then you respond.
So thank you so much for
Louder.
thank you so much for your presentation. So I like your characterization of Farrokhzad as global modernist poet. I like to see that like you had transnational exposure to literature like elsewhere, and she was influenced by them. But discussion of her poetry has mostly done in like, Iranian national context, as also very strong appreciation with that. But did you get any like sense while you were like working on the poetry very close that she could have been talking to like global audience, like any like she had taken into account with the global audience at all, or like any personal movement like she's talking to you like across space and time? I was wondering like whether we should read poetry just like confined in like national boundary. It's like 1950, 1960. Very good.
Yasser, would you like to ask your question too? And then.
Thanks for your presentation. Actually, my question is about one. We put it from profile. So, why man in Lebanon, Chirag, Bia. But I think Divār is big word. It's the surface saying Boyash, Master Haram, Asir, Bazan, Bia. Based on Forugh Farrokhzad style, it should be Bia. And as you said, it's a new edition. Just the reason for this for it was just this.
How do you say modern Persian, colloquial Persian? Is it colloquial or is it? Yeah. No, she edited this poem several times. Yes.
Cannot be in this time.
She changed the poem several times, and I think that in some editions it appeared as Divār, and in her final edition of the text, the one published in 1964, she wrote Divār. I think that she's thinking about the colloquial aspect of it, I think, more than the classical. I think that there is this intimacy that is created by she's breaking the meter, the rules of the meter. I think that there is some sort of experimentation that goes to the colloquial level rather than the classic. I think yes. But it's a good question. Yeah, it's worth considering in what moment she exactly switched from the Divār to the BR. Yes, no, it's a fascinating problem. I was counting syllables for a long time to see what is magically acceptable, what is not. This is a great question. It's I don't think that Farrokhzad was expecting that her poetry would be received beyond the boundaries of Iranian culture, literary culture. I don't see any. I think that she was looking at cinema. I think that she knew that her cinema would transcend national boundaries. She knew and she thought that the language of cinema, much more than poetry, can do that. And she has this beautiful letter that she's writing from Pesaro at the film festival to which she, I think in 1960, was it 66 or 65? A year or two before her death. And she says it. She sees it. This is the medium. This is the new medium that we need to rely on in order to talk to all the people. But with poetry, she was not expecting that. This is interesting, also because an author who was relying so much on translations from French, from English, from Chinese, from Japanese, from German, and so she was not looking at that. And this is one of the marvels and the mysteries of literature, that one an author creates something in a specific time in history, in a given place, and then things goes and, you know, across the centuries and takes other shapes and creates new things. So it's one of the beauties of these things. And the fact that it was not initially was only bound to that cultural context does not prevent us from admiring, you know, the process. It's you know, a global literature in its own making. So thank you.
Thank you. Please join me to thank Professor Ingenito for his engaging and marvelous presentation.